Hello everyone, you are on the True Story channel. The Second World War is still the largest and bloodiest conflict in the history of mankind. Most often in the media and on the internet they talk about the European theater of this war, about the struggle between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. However, at the same time, no less large-scale hostilities were unfolding in Asia, where Japan pursued a policy of seizing neighboring countries and territories. Japan's main adversary in the region was China. Following the results of the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–1895, the Chinese were forced to cede Taiwan to the enemy. Japan was in dire need of natural resources, so it sought to capture strategically important and rich regions. In 1910, the Empire of Japan annexed Korea, and in the early 1930s they resumed aggressive actions against China. In 1931, the Japanese army occupied Chinese Manchuria and created the puppet state of Manchukuo on its territory. Here was located a large Japanese military group, known as the Kwantung Army. At this time, the Republic of China was weakened by the civil war that had been going on since 1927 between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang. In addition, the power of the center in the regions was often purely nominal, but in reality local generals and officials ruled locally. The combat effectiveness of the Chinese units was extremely low. The soldiers were poorly trained and armed. Under such conditions, China could not offer serious resistance to a strong enemy. However, Japan was initially afraid to openly start a full-scale war on the continent. Since the time of the occupation of Manchuria, fighting has often erupted between the parties in the border areas. So the Japanese gradually seized control of all of northern China, reaching the approaches to Beijing. Despite the fact that hostilities have been periodically going on since 1931. It is generally accepted that a full-fledged the Sino-Japanese War began only in 1937. In China, the total casualties of the military and civilian population are estimated at 35 million people, making China one of the countries most affected by the Second World War. The Japanese armed forces used terror and scorched earth tactics against the local population, which led to huge losses among Chinese prisoners of war and civilians. During the hostilities, the Japanese massively used chemical and biological weapons prohibited by international law. Poison gases were also used. The Japanese used the Lugou Bridge incident, also known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident, as a formal pretext for the start of large-scale hostilities. In Tianjin, not far from Beijing, since the beginning of the 20th century, since the time of the Boxer Rebellion, the so-called the Japanese Garrison Army was quartered. On July 7, 1937, its command accused the garrison of the Chinese Wanping fortress of kidnapping a Japanese soldier. The Chinese refused to comply with the Japanese demand for admission to the fortress. After which hostilities began. With the outbreak of a full-scale war with Japan, Kuomintang leader Chiang Kai-shek and the Communists agreed to end the civil war and jointly confront the aggressor. The Japanese quickly occupied Beijing and Tianjin and quickly moved south and west, meeting only weak and scattered resistance from poorly armed Chinese troops. In August 1937, the Battle of Shanghai began, which became one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the war. The Japanese were able to completely capture the city only in November. After the capture of Shanghai, the Japanese army quickly occupied the capital of China, Nanjing. The city was burned and plundered. Losses of the civilian population at the hands of Japanese soldiers in Nanjing are estimated at 300,000 people. These events known as the Nanjing Massacre. With the outbreak of the war, The Chinese began to receive military assistance from the Soviet Union. Soviet specialists and instructors operated in China. In 1940, the Chinese Communists, using Soviet weapons, successfully carried out a major offensive operation, known as the 100 Regiments Campaign. Over time, relations between the USSR and the Chinese government began to deteriorate and the Soviet Union stopped supporting China. Since 1941, the Chinese Army has received weapons and raw materials under the American Lend-Lease program. Taking into account the fact that almost all major Chinese ports were occupied by Japan, there were overland routes for the delivery of military cargo through British Burma and French Indochina. The Japanese sought to eliminate the supply routes for Chinese troops. In September 1940 they invaded Indochina, and in 1942 Burma was captured. In December 1941, the United States and Great Britain began the war against Japan, and the Pacific Theater of Operations was opened. From that time on, the Chinese front actually became secondary. By that time the Japanese had already captured many strategically important points in the east and north of China. Due to the capture of Burma by the Japanese, the supply of goods to China was greatly reduced. In parts of the Chinese army, an acute shortage of weapons and ammunition began to be felt. Japan often began to use the tactics of small local operations. By 1945, the Japanese suffered a series of major defeats from the Americans in the Pacific Ocean. Their combat effectiveness fell. On April 5, 1945, the USSR unilaterally denounced the Neutrality Pact with Japan, and on August 8 declared war on the Japanese. This was done in accordance with the agreement concluded at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Soviet troops launched an offensive in Manchuria and quickly defeated the Japanese Kwantung Army. Thus, northeast China and the northern part of the Korean peninsula were liberated. Simultaneously with the Soviet offensive, an offensive by Chinese troops began along the entire front. The entry of the USSR into the war, as well as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki carried out by the Americans, accelerated the defeat of Japan. On August 14, 1945, the Japanese emperor announced his surrender. On September 2, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the United States ship Missouri, an act of surrender was signed by the Japanese armed forces. On September 9, Japan's surrender was accepted by a representative of the government of the Republic of China. Thus ended the Second World War. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. A lot of interesting things are ahead.